is it true that Hamas have been historically funded in ways that are surprising and unusual, in much the same way, though with sort of obviously greater consequence, that the Democrats had kind of, what did they call it, like Pied Piper strategies to support Republican candidates that they would prefer to face, or to bias the public perception of the Republicans as a movement that's further to the right and more should we say, populist than otherwise might happen without the support of these candidates. Is Hamas ever been the recipient of funding that's, should be put simply, Israeli? And also, how, like, when you're having these, this is probably more relevant than ever before. We exist in these spaces where it's very difficult to even get the opposing perspectives to come together. Like when I was most recently having a conversation with someone who had the contrary view to you, like they were saying, there have been numerous attempts to negotiate. Yasser Arafat had an opportunity for a deal. The two-state solution has been suggested many times. So on one hand, I'd like to say, is part of Hamas's origin has Hamas been inflated or funded in ways that were to tactical and strategic, and a deliberate attempt to destabilize that region? That's one part of my question. And the other part of my question is, if you were taking the sort of perspective of your opponent, would you highlight potential deals that have been offered previously that have not been taken up by, I don't know, the PLO or former incarnations of the current resistance movement, to use your phrase?
Right. So Hamas was from the beginning. So Hamas came out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It is a creation, and the first leaders of Hamas, I knew Rantisi, one of the heads of Hamas, until the Israelis assassinated him. I used to have dinner at his home. I knew his wife, who was just killed a couple of weeks ago by the Israelis. They came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Fatah was a secular revolutionary movement. And so when I started covering Gaza in the late 1980s, it was noticeable that the Hamas militant group, which was very small, was not swept up in the mass arrests. Israel occupied Gaza at the time. That all the focus was on Fatah. Bibi Netanyahu followed this strategy where he allowed Qatar, and I was just in Qatar, to fund Hamas because he saw those divisions within the Palestinian diaspora, or in the Palestinian community, useful in terms of splintering power. So yes, this was a strategy that, of course, has failed miserably. But the Palestinian Authority really functions as a colonial police force. It is completely under the control of Israel. It has very little popular support, including in the West Bank. And this notion that the Palestinian Authority is somehow going to administer Gaza is farcical. Initially, the United States reached out to Egypt to see that after this devastation, would Egyptian security forces go in and occupy Gaza? Egypt obviously refused. So yes, this was a misguided policy. It reminds me of what happened in Syria when the White House got this ridiculous idea that they were going to fund quote unquote moderate rebels. And then, of course, ISIS and Al Qaeda and all these groups just crossed the border into Syria. And we ended up bombing the very people we armed. So it's very similar to that terrible, terrible miscalculation. So yes, Israel from the beginning nurtured, fostered Hamas, and Netanyahu in particular. There's statements by Netanyahu talking about the support for Hamas being an effective tool to fracture Palestinian power.
What about the deals thing that I mentioned in the mix with that question, Chris?
Oslo. Look, the Oslo Accords. I covered the Oslo Accords, so I reported on them for the New York Times. The Oslo Accords were designed. So this was driven by Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin, because of the Oslo Accords, was hated by the Israeli right, in particular AIPAC and the Zionist or Israel lobby in the United States. When he was running against Bibi Netanyahu, I covered that election. They pumped tons of money into the Netanyahu campaign. Netanyahu is a creation of the right-wing Zionist movements. Remember, he speaks fluent English. He went to MIT and lived outside of Philadelphia. Rabin was detested, and at the Netanyahu rallies, and I was there, Rabin was dressed in a Nazi in an effigy in a Nazi uniform and burned. People chanted death to Rabin. At one point, Netanyahu walked in front of a mock funeral for Rabin, and then, of course, Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist and a follower of Netanyahu, and Leah Rabin, Rabin's widow, to the day she died, blamed Netanyahu and his supporters for the murder of her husband. So the whole Netanyahu is a creation of this right wing, and I encourage all of your viewers to watch The Lobby. Al Jazeera did an undercover, sent a very courageous kid inside the lobby with a hidden camera, the Zionist or the Israel lobby, both in the UK. That was broadcast on Al Jazeera, and then they did another one in the United States, and Israel put enough pressure on Al Jazeera so that it wasn't broadcast, but you can watch pirated copies on Electronic Intifada, I think, has put it up. But you see the power of the lobby. I mean, they're just putting $100 million. They just announced AIPAC's putting $100 million to defeat AOC and the other Ilhan Omar and the other members who have called for a ceasefire. They have tremendous reach. So Rabin was detested and hated because of Oslo. But Oslo was, I think Rabin's, there was a good and a bad side to Rabin. The good side was that he realized that the occupation was poisoning and destroying his country, and it had to end. The bad side is that he thought that by withdrawing, he could create a quisling, in essence, colonial force, which was embodied in the Palestine Authority, that would do the bidding of Israel, and that's what Mahmoud Abbas does. Arafat, and I knew Arafat very well, Arafat's, for all his quirks, and he had many of them, nevertheless drew a line. He was not willing to be an Israeli puppet, and I think there's very strong evidence, he ended his life under house arrest, that the Israelis poisoned him to death. I think that's not conclusive, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that I think leads those of us who knew him and covered it to believe that that's what took place. The Oslo Accords were never viable in terms of establishing an actual independent Palestinian state, because remember, Israel controlled the borders. And by controlling the borders, for instance, in Gaza, they don't occupy Gaza, but because they control the borders, they control what goes in, what goes out. And that was true before October 7th. And they could shut everything down in an instant, including, as they have done now with this horrific assault on Gaza, the water supply, the electricity, the power plants, along, of course, with food. I mean, people were seeing serious cases of malnutrition. There's no sanitation anymore in Gaza. Many people have been pushed to the south, most of the north, 1.1 million Palestinians. And we must remember Gaza is very tiny. It's only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. It's one of the most densely packed places on the planet. And you mentioned, Russell, about Hamas atrocities, and there's no question that there were horrific atrocities that were carried out. But it's also an atrocity to drop 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of refugee camps. I am not absolving Hamas, but the atrocities that are carried out, I would call state terrorism on Israel, are even, I think at this point, even more egregious than what Hamas carried out on October 7th, certainly in terms of numbers.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.